Caitlin Clark gives up first-class seat. Then something extraordinary happens. When Caitlin Clark, the legendary basketball star admired for her humility both on and off the court, gave up her first-class seat for an elderly veteran, no one could have predicted the remarkable turn of events that would follow mid-flight. What happened next left every passenger absolutely speechless. The soft glow of cabin lights flickered as passengers settled into their seats, the usual pre-flight hustle mixing with anticipation in the air. It was a crisp morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, and Flight 247 to Newark was fully booked. Caitlin Clark, casually dressed in a sweatshirt and sneakers, sat in first class, her headphones on and a book open in her lap. Despite being instantly recognizable to basketball fans, she carried herself with an air of quiet ease, hoping to avoid any unnecessary attention. Across the aisle in the economy section, an elderly man in his late 70s carefully made his way to his seat. His neatly combed silver hair and an aged leather duffel bag hinted at years of stories untold. But what truly stood out was his military jacket, worn, yet adorned with faded patches and medals that spoke volumes of his decades of service and sacrifice. As he passed by, passengers exchanged knowing glances, silently acknowledging the quiet dignity in his steps. Eventually, he settled near the rear of the plane, squeezed between a businessman glued to his laptop and a restless toddler. Flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles, ensuring everyone was seated and carry-on bags were properly stowed. Just as the cabin doors closed, a murmur of discomfort rippled through the plane. The man sitting beside the veteran appeared irritated, voicing complaints about the lack of space. Though the veteran apologized repeatedly, the tension only grew. Caitlin, lost in her book, lifted her eyes at the growing commotion. From her vantage point, she saw the elderly man struggling to ease the situation. Her brow furrowed as she observed for a few moments. Then, without hesitation, she pressed the call button. When a flight attendant arrived, Caitlin spoke in a calm yet firm tone. "Excuse me, could I switch seats with a gentleman wearing the military jacket?" For a brief moment, the attendant blinked in surprise. Passengers in first class turned their heads, intrigued by the unexpected request. But Caitlin's expression was unwavering, her voice steady yet kind. "Let me check," the attendant responded, quickly making her way down the aisle. Meanwhile, Caitlin stood up, retrieving her carry-on bag. A woman seated nearby leaned in, her voice a hushed whisper. "You don't have to do that, you paid for the seat." Caitlin simply shrugged and offered a small smile. "Some people deserve it more." The whispers in first class grew louder. Moments later, the flight attendant returned, admiration clear in her eyes. "He said he'd be honored to switch," she informed Caitlin with a nod. Without a second thought, Caitlin grabbed her bag and started down the narrow aisle. As she passed, passengers whispered amongst themselves, some discreetly taking photos. But Caitlin's focus remained on the elderly veteran. When she reached his row, the veteran looked up, eyes filled with surprise. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice carrying both gratitude and disbelief. Caitlin nodded, extending her hand. "I'm sure. Thank you for your service. Please take my seat." For a brief moment, he studied her face, as if searching for any sign of insincerity. But the determination in her eyes was unmistakable. Slowly, he rose to his feet, gripping her hand firmly. "Well, thank you, miss. That's mighty kind of you." As the veteran walked toward first class, murmurs of admiration rippled through the cabin. A young mother in row 15 leaned toward her teenage son. "Did you see that? She gave up her first-class seat." Caitlin slipped into the now-empty economy seat, tucking her long legs into the cramped space. She seemed completely unbothered by the discomfort, reopening her book and immersing herself in its pages. The businessman beside her glanced over, shaking his head in disbelief. "Never seen anything like that on a flight." Caitlin simply smiled and turned back to her reading. Meanwhile, in first class, the veteran eased into his new seat, adjusting the plush armrest with a mix of gratitude and astonishment. A flight attendant approached, offering him a warm blanket and a drink. The young lady insisted you have the seat, she said softly. The veteran nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. It's been years since anyone treated me like this. Back in economy, Caitlin remained unaware of the growing buzz surrounding her kind gesture. Passengers whispered, craning their necks to steal glances at her. A flight attendant discreetly approached. Miss Clark, is there anything you need? Caitlin shook her head, offering a polite smile. No, thank you. I'm all set. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin. The veteran sat quietly, gazing out the window, his hands resting on his lap. After a long pause, he turned to the woman seated next to him. I need to say something, he began, his voice steady but low. The woman, intrigued, nodded. Of course. Adjusting a small purple heart pin on his lapel, he let out a deep sigh. That young woman who gave me this seat, her family changed my life once. The woman blinked, taken aback. What do you mean? The veteran leaned back in his seat, his expression turning wistful. Decades ago, after the Gulf War, I came home injured. Had no family, nowhere to go. Ended up in Iowa, struggling to rebuild my life. One day, I sat outside a diner, unsure where my next meal would come from. A man stopped and asked if I was okay. That man was Caitlin Clark's grandfather. The woman's eyes widened in astonishment. Her grandfather? The veteran nodded. He didn't just hand me some change and walk away. He sat with me, listened to my story, made sure I had a roof over my head. Even helped me find work. Never asked for anything in return, just said, you served this country, and we owe you for that. I never forgot those words. By now, several passengers in first class had overheard, their expressions shifting from curiosity to admiration. And today, his granddaughter gave you her seat, the woman murmured. It's like life came full circle. The veteran nodded, a faint smile appearing. I always wanted to thank her family, but I never got the chance. Thought that moment was lost forever. But now, he trailed off, glancing toward economy, where Caitlin sat quietly, unaware of the ripple her kindness had caused. The conversation spread through the cabin. A man across the aisle, likely in his 40s, spoke up. I'm sorry to interrupt, but your story really hit home. My father served in the Gulf War. He always said the smallest gestures of kindness made the biggest difference when he returned. The veteran's face softened. It's true. Back then, I thought my life was over, but someone took the time to care. And today, Caitlin Clark reminded me of that. Across the plane, whispers turned into quiet reflections. A mother, rocking her sleeping toddler, murmured, kindness like that you don't see every day. And in that moment, Caitlin Clark's simple act of selflessness became so much more. It became a symbol of the kindness that can change lives forever.